Hi, my name is Smriti Rao, and I've lived in Needham since 2007. I am not a citizen of the United States, and for the longest time, I used that to explain why I wasn't more involved in our town and in our community. But eventually, I realized that citizenship is not the same as feeling at home, and that Needham had indeed become my home. So, when Equal Justice in Needham was formed last year in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, I thought this was a wonderful way for me to contribute what I could to EJN's work on equitable public safety and on affordable housing. And while some of the work has raised issues that are deeply unsettling to me, not just to others, I will say that this is joyous and joyful work. I have met so many wonderful, interesting people, learned so much about the complexities and nuances of our town, and feel so much more rooted and connected. So I encourage you all, whether you are citizens or not, whether you are immigrants like me or not, please join us in our work to try to make our collective home more inclusive and more welcoming. In today's show, we'll take a look back at what E.JN has been doing over the last year.
Hello, and welcome to Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice in Needham. I'm the show host, Massiel Gallardo. Equal Justice in Needham was formed in the spring of 2020 in response to the George Floyd murder and the realization that such injustice can happen anywhere, even here in Needham. E.JN is an informal group of local residents that work together on various social justice issues that affect the town. Today, we have several E.JN participants with us to discuss their work in 2021 and their goals for the future. I welcome Rebecca Waber, who has been working on policing issues and topics, Noah Mertz, one of the founders of E.JN, who's now focusing on elections, Jill Olive, an early childhood educator who is bringing children into the discussion about social justice, and Oscar Mertz, an architect, affordable housing activist, and Noah's father. Welcome, everyone. Let's start with a question for all of you. What impact has E.JN had on the town so far? Feel free to jump in.
Well, Massiel, I'll start.
Thank you.
I think it's been wonderful that, particularly in our group, I think that we're getting more emails from families about concerns maybe in education in Needham, or concerns about what the curriculum is in the preschool programs, and wanting to engage in more conversation at home. I feel like our enrollment in our programming has increased. And that's, to me, is a sign that we are getting the word out.
It's also interesting, Maciel, that in our housing working group, we've had an open house that's sort of on a regular basis, every 6 weeks or so. We've tried to have just an open night when people could join. And we've had some really interesting participation, and we've had people who've actually come and joined our group. So it's pretty fun, because we're starting to understand that people are getting the message that we're doing things, and we've been involved with a pretty busy 2021, which we'll talk about in further detail. But it's really fun to have new people come and then actually sign up for to be a part of one of our working groups. Well, it's been pretty exciting to see the steady sort of interest grow in people.
Yeah, I mean, 2021 is our first full year, right?
Yeah.
It's like you're saying, Oscar, it's cool to see the name, like people have now heard of us and know it's a place to come to talk about these things. And I think find your own way to work on issues that you want to work on, because that has been how we, there's not a centralized structure. There's not someone calling the shots. It's what are the things that you want to work on with people who are also going to want to work on these sorts of things.
Well, just having grown up in Needham, there's something going on in town that I never witnessed or experienced, which is this like engagement with local politics. And that could just be my own increased engagement in local politics. But I think there's this kind of greater consciousness or awareness of like, oh, maybe things aren't the way that I always thought that they were. And like, where's the first place to look and start to get involved? Maybe not the federal level or even the state, but like right in my own town. And I've noticed that talking to high schoolers too. That was not a thing going on when I was in high school 8 years ago. And I think there's some sort of a shift in political consciousness going on in Needham. And I think E.JN has been a part of that and come out of that, but it has also been, like Rebecca's saying, a space for people to sort of plug in and invest that newfound sort of interest or awareness into something that's actually, I think, moved the needle on certain issues and actually potentially influence some real like policy changes in town, or at least some attitudes that are starting to shift.
Do the other panelists also share in the same feeling that Needham residents are becoming more engaged in town governance?
I think the election turnouts have been a sign of that.
I think it's going to be a natural, because of the changeover of all of the town meeting representation, that the message to the town, I think, has gotten out that this is one of those few times, every 10 years when we get a chance to really join something at an entry level where it's so open. And we are very respectful of people's needs to, if they have to back off and they can't make certain meetings, where it's a very flexible schedule. And
well, thank you, everyone. Now let's look a little deeper into the trajectory and the community work of E.JN. It's been 1 year since the Marvin Henry racial profiling incident that happened outside of CVS in Needham Heights. Rebecca, what has been happening with public safety issues since then?
Early in the year, we had our public safety report, part 2, that had a lot of data from the Needham police over the last 3 years, looking at lots of different sorts of interactions with the public, all public data that we got in a public records request. And there was a lot of meaty information in there. There were racial disparities among people, non-resident versus resident disparities, and things that definitely beg the question of why is this happening? To what extent might this not be appropriate? What's happening? So there was a lot of meaty data in there that really led us to call for recommendations around increased oversight, increased analysis, and really keeping tabs on these things over time in a much more robust way and in a much more public way. And we were able to present these findings to the town in a few different formats, to the community, and also to the select board. And I do think that while not in a huge explosive way, I do think that has influenced discourse in the town, with people just being more aware, like Noah was saying earlier, man, maybe some things that we don't want to be happening, maybe they're happening here. And actually there's some evidence, to back up that might be happening. And it's not just, it's not saying that any individual person is a bad person. It's about saying, like, are there some trends here, some data here that means that maybe we need some different kinds of metrics and oversight in the future. So I think that was a really important piece of work.
It sounds like a lot of data. The EJN working group that you collaborate in sounds like has collected a lot of data around this topic. Is this information public?
The reports are all available on EJN's website. Not only is the report available, but the raw data is all available as well. And again, this raw data came from the Needham Police Department itself. So it isn't something that came from some external source or anything like that. All we did was ask some questions and report back to the town what our own data says, which our main point is that's something that really the town should be doing for itself on an ongoing basis. You know, EJN doesn't want to be policing the police. We want to say, hey, town and police, this is something you should be doing all the time. And I would say in terms of what has changed in the town, I think there has been positive incremental things that have happened in the town. And on that point, in particular, there has been the hire by the town of a data analyst. And so we'll need to see what that person does and how that contributes to this ask for oversight. And so I think it's too soon to say, mission accomplished, but I do think that's really positive, positive to have that person in that role because that's something new.
Absolutely. And that is a step forward in the right direction. And speaking about moving forward in historical events in town, town elections. Noah, we recently had a special election for town select board seat, and this year we had historical town elections overall. Why was that town election so important, and what is EJN doing around other local elections?
Thanks. It was a really big year for elections in the history of our town. And we initially, as a group, when we came together in the aftermath of the George Floyd uprisings, were really in the midst of them. We were focusing on public safety things and housing, like Oscar's going to talk about in a bit, and early childhood education, like Jill's going to talk about. And elections was sort of an afterthought. But it wasn't really until we realized there was sort of a dearth of public engagement in not only these sort of specific issues, but just like in the public process in general of how the town is run. A focus that I took interest in was sort of rekindling the civic engagement in myself and hopefully throughout the town in the public process of our democracy. If we don't have people bringing the awareness and attention to things that need to change to the right sort of levers of power in our formal structure, which I think is incredibly democratic. The town meeting structure of Needham is potentially the most democratic system I can think of a representative democracy. But what happens when you don't have that engagement of the general population? There is a disconnect between sort of the people and then the small political class who are making decisions that affect everybody in town. And there are a lot of potential reasons why that could happen, a culture of kind of disengagement with the political process. But we saw some successes early on in our work together around particularly a citizens petition at town meeting to declare that we need to look into housing and public safety for systemic racism. And that was a really big turning point, but we also realized there's only so much that we can do to affect change sort of from the margins, from the outside, as a sort of a loose cohort of people working in public interests. And so we decided, well, luckily we had a few people among us who were interested in actually running for these positions, because really anybody can. Rebecca Waber was one of them who ran for school committee. Lakshmi Balachandra ran for select board along with Marcus Nelson. And Liz Lee from E.JN for Families, working with Jill, ran for school committee as well. Lakshmi and Marcus both won, which was very exciting for the town, the first two non-white select board members in the history of the town. it was not quite a historic turnout, but it was a dramatically higher turnout than the previous year. That's a part of like being in this town, is being a member of the voting public, and potentially even running myself. And so that's the big push that we've been making lately, especially in this special election, and then looking to the upcoming 2022 elections, is doing as much outreach as we can to specifically historically underrepresented or historically marginalized groups that are just far underrepresented in our government right now. There are absolutely qualified candidates in our town who could run, and we are doing everything that we can through our own personal connections and through platforms like this to spread the message that if you are a voting person in Needham, you could potentially run for town meeting. There are 3 school committee seats coming up, and there's another select board seat coming up. And again, we really do need more representation from groups that have just not typically been in these positions of really important decision-making power.
Thank you, Noah. In recent years, since my family and I moved to Needham, I have witnessed an increase in conversations among parents around local elections. And I think that's wonderful. That's great. Because it's important for parents to have these conversations at home. I would like to invite a dear friend of mine and collaborator of EJN for Families, Jill Olive. Jill, you and I are strong proponents for families to have conversations at home around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as an early childhood educator, would you share with us why is it so important for families to discuss social justice issues with young children? And how do the programs facilitated by E.JN for Families help in starting those conversations?
Thank you, Massiel. Well, research shows that it's never too early to have conversations with your children about race, racism, fairness, diversity, and equity. So knowing that our group has really worked hard to provide programs so that parents can have conversations with their children at home. And the way we've gone about it is we have 2 programs that we do at Equal Justice Needham for Families. Once a month, we offer a story time for families on the 2nd Sunday of the month. And the topics are either on skin color, standing up for others. It could be on food insecurities, etc., on topics that may be challenging for families to have conversations about. We also had Peter Reynolds, who is a wonderful author, read his book called Upstander. And it was to help kids recognize that they can feel empowered to stand up for some injustice, whether it's to themselves or to a friend. Was wondering, Massiel, if you might just mention about the lunch equity program that was part of E.JN and supported our Storytime, supported that fundraising event. Do you mind sharing about that?
No, not at all. Absolutely. It was impressive to see during that story. It was a children's book story about food insecurity and how it neatly tied in with the discussion about what about our town? What about our neighbors? Oftentimes you take a look at a community like Needham and you would not assume that anybody is suffering in silence and not being able to bring dinner to table for themselves or for their children. At least one kid in every classroom in Needham schools is having food insecurity. Families from that family story, learned about what goes on, what community projects are going on, one of them the Lunch Equity Project, and we received a higher number of contributions thanks to that family story time.
And of course, I want to mention about our Needham Speaks program. That is another once a month program, an evening program for adults. And recently we had a conversation with a woman who has done a lot of work, an activist, and has worked with families about equity and talking to young children about racism. And the title was How to Start a Conversation with Young Children About Racism. It was a very informative evening, and I think everybody went away with new book titles and how to jumpstart these conversations at home. If anybody is interested in joining our EJN or Equal Justice Needham for Families, we're always looking for new ideas, programming, and just more chatting about what kinds of things can happen in Needham. What would you like to see change?
Thank you. Now, moving on to another topic of conversation that has commanded attention in town, especially during recent local elections, housing. Oscar, we know that there has been housing discrimination in Needham in the past, and its effects are still evident today. How is E.JN Housing Working Group addressing inequities in housing?
It's a great question and a complicated question. We have people in our housing working group who are passionate about a lot of things. The housing issue in general is pretty complicated, and you come at it from different points of view. There are different levels of affordable housing that we're working towards. There's deeply affordable housing where people need to have subsidies and need to find, and there's a Needham Housing Authority that manages a large number of properties in town. And they are in the middle of a campaign to renovate a lot of their buildings and convert some of their buildings so that there's actually a more opportunity for people to even become homeowners. And I think that's another critical opportunity for people who have been discriminated against for so long. It's been such a challenge for people of color and people who've been victims of the redlining, for centuries. We know that this is embedded deeply in all of our communities. We found that part of what has come out in this last year is a great working relationship and a sense of getting more transparency with our planning board and select board in town to address some of these issues. And to the extent that the town has established a new affordable housing study group, which will take the next 10 months to understand where the housing needs are in town, and then to formulate plans and get community engagement on how we can solve these problems together and listen to the community. And then to put together plans to actually enact these changes in zoning so we can get a broader diversity of people who can come to Needham. The affordability in town is dramatically out of balance. We all know that there's an affordability gap that is difficult for everyone to find housing in town at all different levels. But I think so there are several groups in the housing working group that are doing really interesting work. And so people who are interested in working at the state level with advocacy are really working closely with Denise Garlick. And for the Needham Housing Authority, one of the things that we think is going to be coming through, I think it was confirmed recently, that our advocacy group has talked to Denise and found that $1.2 million has been confirmed that it would be coming to the Needham Housing Authority. And this is all part of the fundraising for their new promotion of renovating the buildings that they have. There's lots of work to be done for the Needham Housing Authority. But it's one of the old, longstanding affordable housing organizations in the state. There's also a lot of advocacy that we're doing for changing some of the zoning, trying to get different kinds of housing that gets smaller housing, change single family zoning potentially to 2-family zoning, 3 and 4 family. So adding the concept of building a little bit more density around some of our transit So those are the places where it makes a lot of sense, where people who don't have a car or who need to be able to move in and out of town and be on a transit line. It makes it a lot easier for us to be able to build where we have that demand and where we have the access to all of our commercial areas and our transit stations, because Needham's so lucky to have 4 train stations. So I think at the end of the day, the housing issue, as complex as it is really on a very good path to get addressed through a number of different methods, including zoning, including getting funding from state and federal governments. So we're excited about participating in that and building a stronger coalition of all the interest groups in town. But it is about getting people involved. And so we're seeking people who are interested in helping us solve all these issues and getting these issues in front of people.
Thank you, Oscar. And thank you to all panelists for speaking with us today. As we learned in today's program, there are many ways for you to get involved in equity issues in town. It's a fun and meaningful way for neighbors to meet interesting people and to make a difference. So if you live, work, or play in Needham and want to learn how to get involved, please visit the website equaljusticeneedham.org or reach out to thishappenshereinneedham@gmail.com. And before we sign off, please take a moment to fill out a poll on the EJN website about what we covered today. Your feedback will help plan future conversations on moving forward together. It was great to be your host today. Until next time.